Hello everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Nelson Davis. Today we're going to be installing this bearing and hub kit on the rear of this 2010 Ford Explorer Sport Trac. This is one of the more difficult bearing and hub installations that there is out there. It requires some very specialized tools and equipment in order to do this job effectively and accurately without damage to anything. As you can see to my right, we have a 20-ton hydraulic bearing press, along with some press support plates, various adapters and collets that are going to be necessary in order to properly and accurately remove the bearing and hub assembly from the steering knuckle. We have other press support plates, collets, adapters of various sizes, again, that are really going to be required in order to properly remove and install this bearing assembly from this knuckle. Without these specialized tools and equipment, it's very, very difficult to do this without causing any damage to the bearing. You may attempt to install a bearing and hub into this knuckle, and if you don't install it correctly, you may cause damage to the bearing, and it may not be immediately apparent, but it will cause that bearing to fail prematurely. So it is very, very critical that you have the right tools and equipment, snap ring pliers, in order to do this job effectively. We suggest if you don't have this equipment that you actually take your vehicle to a professional repair shop in order to get this done precisely and accurately without any damage to the vehicle or to the replacement bearing. The next step in this process is to get this knuckle assembly off the rear of this vehicle. The wheel bearing and the hub are pressed into that knuckle assembly, so we need to remove the knuckle so we can press the old bearing and hub out, take it to the press the new bearing and hub in there. So the first thing is to remove this brake caliper and of course the brake rotor. Two bolts hold the caliper to the knuckle assembly. 10mm bolts. We'll just get those loose, take those out. And we'll take our brake caliper, our brake pads off, and just kind of carefully hang it with this bungee cord so that we don't damage the brake hose. We don't want to just let it hang there and possibly damage the brake hose, so we'll support it. Then we've got to remove this rotor, which sometimes they're stuck. Sometimes you got to wiggle and twist them a little bit and shake them and move them around, and you just kind of keep working them, and eventually it'll release from those parking brake shoes that are behind there. Just kind of set it off to the side. Next, we need to remove our ABS wheel speed sensor. It's held in place by a little small Torx bolt, number 30 Torx bolt, which bolts it to the knuckle. So we need to remove that bolt, a little small one, on the back side of the knuckle here. And once we remove that bolt, then you can carefully wiggle and twist and move that ABS wheel speed sensor around, and it'll separate from the hub. And we'll just kind of position it off to the side out of the way here too. The next thing is we need to remove the parking brake cable and cable actuators that are attached to these rear parking brake shoes. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can disconnect the cable assembly from the parking brake actuators. Or if you're careful, you can pry these brake shoes back out of the way and just wiggle and twist, and those parking brake actuators will come out the back side of this backing plate from the hub. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is remove this bolt holding this parking brake cable bracket, just to give us a little more room and maneuverability and allow this parking brake cable to release from this control arm here. Now, like I said, if you take a big screwdriver, you can sometimes pry these parking brake shoes back a little bit, and at the same time just kind of wiggle and twist. And these parking brake actuators will sometimes release. They slide through a rubber boot on the back side of this knuckle assembly. And if you wiggle and twist, you can sometimes slide them both right out of there, like so. There's one, and there's the other one. And that way you don't necessarily have to disconnect the parking brake cable from these parking brake lever actuators, and just kind of position that off to the side. Next thing is to remove our drive axle nut. Okay. Now, often these drive axles will be kind of stuck or seized to the hub. In some cases, you'll have to use a special tool to separate that axle from the hub. In many cases, if it's not too tight, you can give it a couple of gentle taps with a center punch right in the center of that axle. There's a little indentation there. What you never want to do is hit on the end of that axle with a hammer, because you'll surely damage the axle, you'll damage the threads by doing that. So often a couple of good taps with a punch, like I said, and a hammer will start to separate, just like that axle from the hub. And you can see now, just with hand pressure, I can kind of push it in there somewhat, so I know it's good and separated. The next thing is to remove the 3 bolts which hold this knuckle assembly to the suspension. There's an upper one here, a lower one here, and one on this toe link right here. And you want to pay careful attention to the orientation of those bolts also. They need to go back into the same direction, same position that you removed them, especially this upper one here. The bolt's facing towards the back, the head of the bolt's pointed towards the back like that. If you actually get this one reversed around, on some of these vehicles it will interfere with the wheel when you put the wheel back on the car. So you need to pay careful attention to that orientation there of those bolts, like I said. So let's see about removing this upper one first. There we go. Here's the upper one. Then we have a lower one that we can get right from the back side right here. And the nut for that is actually a captive nut. It's got a little bracket on it that holds it in place. So once you remove it, you can take the nut off. So that's 2 of those 3 bolts that hold that knuckle to the suspension. And again, we want to make sure that axle's separate. Okay, so the next step is I've got to remove this bolt that holds this toe link to this rear suspension member here. So we're going to have to get that from underneath. And then there are 3 bolts that actually hold the knuckle itself to this suspension member also, that have to be removed from the back side. So we'll go underneath and do that next. Okay, so the next step in this process is to remove this outboard toe link bolt. And then there are 3 bolts that come in from the back side of the steering knuckle that hold this knuckle assembly to this lower control arm. So let's get this outboard toe link loose here. And it's just one large bolt and nut. And then we've got to go underneath and kind of from behind to get those 3 bolts that hold the steering knuckle to the lower control arm. So there's 1. There's 2. And there's 3. So we should be able to remove our steering knuckle from our suspension now. And the next step will be to take this to the press and do the pressing operations for the knuckle and bearing assembly. So here we are at our bearing press. We've got the knuckle, hub, and bearing assembly properly mounted, supported with bearing support plates. We've got the proper adapters in order to remove the hub assembly from the knuckle. And that's our first step in this process, to press the hub out of this knuckle assembly. And it's very critical that this is completely level, everything is centered accurately in order to properly press that hub out through the bottom of the knuckle. There's also a few safety precautions that you need to keep in mind whenever you're doing any type of pressing operation like this. We've got safety glasses on. Want to make sure our hands and our fingers are completely clear of the press. We'll operate the press with this handle right here. Our feet are clear. We've got something underneath here to catch the hub assembly when it's pressed out and it drops out of the bottom of the bearing press. Okay, so now we are going to press the old hub assembly out of the bottom of this knuckle. So we're pressing from the back side. The the old hub assembly will drop out of the bottom. And again, it's extremely critical that everything is centered and lined up properly, that this knuckle assembly is completely level as we press this thing. So here we go. You can kind of feel it moving through there, nice and smooth. I can see it actually moving. And that's it. The old knuckle has been separated from the old hub. Okay, so the next step in our process is to actually press the old bearing out of the knuckle assembly. We've got the knuckle assembly properly mounted and secured and supported here with the proper adapters. We've got the proper adapter centered and aligned and nice and level in order to press the old bearing from the knuckle assembly. We've also removed the old retainer ring already with a pair of retainer ring pliers. We're going to throw this in the trash and replace it with a new one when we install the new bearing. Seems to be pushing through nice and easy, nice and smooth. And that's because we've got the proper adapters and we've got everything lined up and leveled and centered correctly. And that's it. The bearing has been pressed out of the old knuckle assembly. Okay, so the next step is to install the new bearing into the knuckle assembly. We've cleaned up the inside of the knuckle assembly. We've cleaned the snap ring groove out nice to make sure there's no rust or corrosion in there. We've got the knuckle assembly properly supported with these press support plates. We've got the correct adapters in order to press this bearing in here safely and accurately. It's very critical, again, that the knuckle is completely level, that everything is centered properly, and you have the correct adapters to press the bearing in. One of the most important things is when we press this bearing in, we want an adapter that will press on the outside race of the bearing. We do not want to press on the center of the bearing or it will be damaged. So this adapter will press right on the outside race of that bearing. Got some other adapters in here. We want to make sure everything, again, is nice and level and centered properly. Let me just check it here real carefully. Make sure we're properly centered. Got safety glasses on, and now we'll go ahead and press that bearing into the knuckle. And as you can see, it's pressing in there nice and smooth, nice and easy. When it gets to the bottom of the knuckle, you'll actually feel it stop. And there it is right there. So that bearing now has been properly pressed into the knuckle assembly. Okay, once that bearing is fully seated into the knuckle, then we're going to install a new retaining ring in the back of the knuckle. And this retaining ring, one side is perfectly flat, the other side is slightly curved. So that slightly curved side needs to face you as you install it. And of course, you'll need to have a good pair of retaining ring pliers in order to install that ring in the back of the knuckle. Okay, so the next step is to press our new hub assembly into the knuckle. The new bearing, of course, has already been pressed in from the back side previously. Now, once again, it's very critical that the knuckle assembly is properly centered, properly supported. We've got press support plates underneath. We've got the proper adapters in order to press that hub into the bearing and knuckle assembly. The new bearing, of course, has to be supported from underneath with the correct adapter. It's critical that we support the center race of that bearing. Otherwise, when you press that new hub into that bearing opening, you will damage that bearing if it's not properly supported. Okay, so let's press this new hub assembly into the bearing and knuckle. We've already applied a little bit of lubricant around the back side of that hub to help it slide in there much more smoothly and freely and easily. But if everything is centered up properly and properly supported, that hub will very easily press into that bearing, as you can see. And that feels like it's just about home. A little bit more. You'll kind of feel it stop, and that's it right there. So that hub has been properly and completely pressed into that knuckle and bearing assembly. Okay, we're ready to do the final installation of our knuckle assembly onto the vehicle. We've previously cleaned the splines and the threaded portion of the drive axle very, very carefully to make sure there's no rust or dirt or debris or grease on it. We've also already installed the knuckle assembly to this suspension member. And there are 3 bolts that come in from the back side that have to be tightened before these other mounting bolts are tightened so that you can access them properly. Those 3 bolts have to have Loctite applied to them, and they have to be torqued to 203 foot-pounds on this particular vehicle. So the next thing we're going to do is tighten the 3 mounting bolts for this knuckle assembly. The first one is the lower outboard knuckle mounting bolt, and it has to be torqued to 203 foot-pounds. The next one is this outboard toe link, and the specifications for that bolt on this vehicle are 240 foot-pounds. And then lastly, we've got this upper outboard knuckle mounting bolt, and the torque specifications for it is 166 foot-pounds. And there we are there. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is remount our ABS wheel speed sensor. It mounts in the back side of the knuckle. It's held in by a little small Torx bolt. There's an index hole to help locate it. And you just have to give it a little bit of a wiggle and a twist. And it will mount in there. Install the bolt. Make sure it's threaded properly and lined up. Give it a few turns by hand. And then we'll finally tighten it up with a small number 30 Torx socket and a small 1/4-inch drive ratchet. Okay, the final steps on the installation procedure for this wheel and hub on this 2010 Ford Explorer is to make sure that we have the park and brake cable properly reinstalled into the brake assembly, which we've previously done. We want to tighten up the bracket for this park and brake cable. Just snug it up because we took it loose earlier. We've already installed the brake rotor and the brake caliper. So now the most important final critical step is the torquing of the drive axle nut. And what we've done previously is taken the old nut and lightly seated it on here in order to properly make sure the axle is seated and everything's lined up properly. Now we're going to take that axle nut off, that old one. We're going to remove it, throw it in the trash, and basically use a brand new drive axle nut, which already has Loctite in there, and tighten it down to the proper specifications, which are 203 foot-pounds. I'm just going to lightly snug it with the gun. That friction and that heat from tightening that nut, as you can see, has released the Loctite on that nut. And now we're going to give it the final torque specification to 203 foot-pounds. And that's it. The installation on this Ford Explorer is now complete.
Here's one important final note. This vehicle has independent rear suspension, and since the knuckle assembly was removed for the hub and bearing replacement, the vehicle alignment should be checked after completing the hub and bearing installation.
My name is Nelson Davis, and again, I'd like to thank you for watching today. If you should ever need any further technical assistance, please feel free to call our toll-free technical hotline at 1-800-228-9672.
Powered by MPA.